You can tell a lot about people from their prayer lives. This morning, as we spent some time together praying in memory and in gratitude for those lives, that said something about who we are as a people of God, grateful for the gifts that God gives us. There are some people out there who have prayer lists, some people in here, who have prayer lists that include the hungry and starving people of the world. Other people pray over their own full plates. Some people put at the top of their list freedom and justice for the poor and downtrodden. Other people place a raise and a new car at the top of their lists. Some prayer lists are full of names. So-and-so who's fighting cancer. So-and-so who needs to find work. So-and-so who have a new baby. Other prayer lists are blank sheets. Some people put themselves on their prayer list under confession, like that tax collector who prayed, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Others enter their names under adoration, like the Pharisee who said, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people." You can tell a lot about people from their prayer lists. At the confirmation retreat at Mechawana 2 weeks ago, one of the things that we talked about was some different styles of prayer. And one of these was the ACTS prayer, ACTS. Adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication. You begin with adoration, prayers of praise and expressions of love and worship, things that describe the qualities and characteristics of God. Things like awesome and glorious God, 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, or simply, oh, holy God. Then you turn to confession, owning up to what we have done or said that is against God's will for us, sins of commission, or the things that we have left undone that we ought to have done or that would have been good and right to do, sins of omission, and asking for forgiveness, sins of prayers of adoration, prayers of confession, and then you turn to thanksgiving, giving thanks for persons and things and experiences, situations, things that previous prayers have had answers to, thanksgiving. And finally, you turn to supplication, prayers of intercession, prayers of need for yourself or for others, especially for other people in need. This is where we turn to those prayer lists and we ask God to help. Today's reading was a prayer, a part of Jesus' priestly prayer, and this part is mostly a prayer of supplication. Each time that I read this particular passage from John, I am startled by the words in verse 9 when he says, "I am not asking on behalf of the world, but on behalf of those whom you gave me." Now, I don't know about you, but I was taught to pray for the world. These words on the surface seem to run counter to the things that Jesus said during his ministry, coming into the world to save the world, to offer salvation to the world. He says here, "I'm not praying for the world, but for these people, these particular ones whom you have given me." If it is our duty to care for the world and to pray for the world, then this prayer seems to suggest that Jesus is contradicting himself, that he doesn't care for those who are not his special personal friends. But I think we need to look a little more deeply. In a closer and more spirit-centered reading, there is something very different there. To live in right relationship with God, we must honor and respect the gifts that God has given us. We must accept the responsibility that comes with having those gifts. I'm thinking specifically about two particular gifts, the gift of free will and the gift of God's covenant relationship. God created us with the gift of free will. And boy, is that a challenge sometimes. That means that we have the freedom to decide whether we will accept the word of God that Jesus brings to us or whether we will turn our backs, whether we will walk away. It's our choice. We have that choice. God's grace makes it possible for us to say yes to God and to the path that Jesus taught us, or to say no. Jesus knew that many would reject the offer that he made, the offer of freedom in service to God. He knew that his ministry would often be misunderstood. He also knew that he could not deny anyone the opportunity to say no. And so when that rich young man turned away from him in sorrow, Jesus did not run after him and try to manipulate him into changing his mind. He let him go. He did not answer him and give him an easier answer. He let him go. Jesus was the Word, and he spoke the Word. And he allowed and still allows the men and women who hear the Word to make up their own minds about whether or not to follow, whether to accept the oil or to stay as water. This, my friends, can be part of the frustration as you continue to make those weekly invitations that we talked about a while back. Remember the challenge? To invite at least one person every week to come to worship. How's it going? Your job, remember, is to invite. Theirs is to say yes or no. And it may take sometimes repeated invitations, yes? The hard part about free will is recognizing that our choices have consequences. Jesus implies in this prayer some of those consequences. When Jesus says that he is not praying for the world, he does not mean that he does not love even those who choose to say no. Even those who choose to remain outside the circle are loved by Christ, and they are covered by his amazing umbrella of prevenient grace, even when they make that choice. He does not mean that he does not hope that in time that they will turn to God's kingdom and receive the joy of relationship. What he means is that he cannot affirm through prayer the consequences of the world's choices to disobey God. He cannot affirm the lies of the world or the brokenness of the world. He cannot affirm the passions and the darknesses of those who choose the world's options rather than God's service. He does not mean that he doesn't pray for the redemption of the world. He means that he cannot pray for the world to continue in its blindness. In this prayer, Jesus prays specifically, however, for those who keep God's word, for those who keep their word, and for those who keep God's covenant. Over and over again, in the reaffirmation of the covenant that God made beginning in the Old Testament time, God names God's people as God's own. You are my people. I am your God. Twice in this part of the prayer, Jesus speaks about that naming. He says, I have manifested your name to those whom you have given me. And he says, Holy Father, keep them in your name. When we name ourselves by God's name, we are not only identifying with the loving power of God, but we are plugging ourselves into that power so that we can become channels of God's power to the world. Prayer is a way of releasing God's power in ourselves and in others. Harry Emerson Fosdick told a story about a young man who sailed in a fishing schooner with his father in the North Atlantic Ocean. One night near the Arctic Circle, the dark came down and the fog closed in and the seas ran high. And the young man was at the wheel doing his best to keep her on course, and the father was standing close by. The father knew that they were in for a bad night. Well, said the father, about this time the women are offering up their prayers for us to the God who holds the waves in the hollow of his hand. And then after a pause, he yelled, all hands on deck. Put a close reef on the mainsail and let run the jib. We have got to get that prayer answered. Prayer releases God's power in ourselves and in others. If we pay attention to Jesus in this high priestly prayer, there are some things we can learn. First, he reminds us simply to pray. When we have a difficult decision to make, remember first of all to get on our knees, whether we do it literally or figuratively, and to pray. Sometimes that's hard to remember. I often say that when I get to the end of my rope, that's when I remember to pray. So I need to cut off a piece of the rope each time so I get there quicker the next time. Jesus took his burdens and his decisions to God, and he stayed on his knees until he felt he knew the will of God. Then he got off his knees and went about his ministry, knowing that he was doing what he felt God called him to do in that time. Prayer comes before action. Jesus also reminds us to pray for others. In 1989, then President George H.W. Bush called on all U.S. citizens to pray for Americans held hostage in Lebanon at that time. And if I may quote, he said, "Even as we search for political solutions to this problem, I believe that prayer is the most important way to deal with the human response to this situation." He called on Christians to say special prayers for the hostages, telling reporters, "I believe in prayer. It gives us strength in time of need. It gives us hope in times of despair. It gives us optimism in times of opportunity." And I need to tell you that that was part of my my sermon plan way before last week. But I am so grateful for those wonderful words of wisdom. Do you believe in intercessory prayer? Yes. Do you believe that it makes a difference? Yes. Do you believe in it enough to pray until you know that God has heard you and then let go of your worry and fretting? That's hard. Do you pray for your church? Do you pray for your family members? Yes. And for your friends? Yes. And for your enemies? Yes. Can you pray and then let go and let God? Sometimes. Good, honest answer. I like that. One more thing we can learn about prayer from the priestly prayer of Jesus is this: to center our prayer not in ourselves and not even in others, but to center our prayer in God. Then there can be movement and change and growth. Prayer is like the difference between a marshy pool and a stream. In the marshy pool, it says, "Lord, here I sit, centered on myself. I wonder why I'm getting nowhere, just collecting moss. Somebody ought to do something for me." But the stream says, "Show me, Lord, which direction to move, and channel me into your ways." A stream can move mountains and level hills and water vast stretches of land because it is not centered on itself, but moves in the way that it is channeled. A young woman was asked if she would be interested in teaching a Sunday school class of young children. And her response was honest. She did not feel channeled in that direction. But she felt there was something else that she could do. And so she volunteered to recruit children and young people. And each Sunday morning, she would fill up her car with children and young people who had no other means of transportation and bring them to Sunday school. Thanks to this woman's dedication, there were Sundays when the number of young people in that church doubled, tripled. Unfortunately, there was some grumbling among those in the pews in this particular church about the rowdiness that occurred when so many unattended children were present. There were some in the church who thought that they should focus on adults and not spend so much time on children and youth. And then some of the children's parents began coming with them to church, thanks to their children's witnesses. One Sunday morning, when an altar call was given, one of the young people came forward with his young brother and his mother. All three of them made commitments that morning to follow Christ. And before long, this family was bringing other families. Eventually, most of those children and youth, and even some of their parents, made decisions to follow Christ. And God used this one woman who felt she was not capable of teaching Sunday school, but who listened to the call of God to change the face of that church. Jesus prays for all those who choose the hard road. He prays that in spite of the difficulty inherent in living in the world, in spite of the temptations, we might be kept in God's name so that we may be one with God. But it is our choice. How do you choose today?